I asked Rev'it if the Stratum Goretex trouser and jacket set represents their flagship product for 2024, and they said that's not really Rev'it's language, but you could call it that and no one will argue. So here we are. What this is definitely sitting at the top of the price point of Rev'it's offering in their Adventure collection, and this is an incredibly capable jacket and trouser set. There's quite a lot to it, so do bear with me. Let's start at the obvious point, which is the pricing. The Stratum, it is stratospherically expensive. So we have £1,250 for the jacket and we have £940 for the trousers. And before you tune off and start typing away, dismissing it already, do bear in mind there are brands who have been operating in the adventure sector for a long time who regularly do well in sales at this price point. This is not taking the piss. This is not a price point absolutely out of kilter with what other high-end brands are offering in adventure. So it's natural for Rev'it, who have been around a long time and do something in all the different categories of riding, to want a piece of that pie. They've been in the adventure sector itself for quite a while, but traditionally their offerings with things like the Dominator have, I would say to put it crudely, been slightly more focused on a touring approach to adventure riding, which is legitimately part of adventure riding. It just means it's a more passive approach in terms of the amount of activity you're likely to be doing on the bike, compared to if you're taking your bike off-road as well as part of the consideration of what you're doing as a rider. If you have something like the Dominator on, it's very, very heavy. It doesn't matter, with the best will in the world, with the flaps opened up and so on and so forth. It's still a very, very heavy and quite sort of all-encompassing piece of gear, which if you have active riding and you're off-road and it's warm, isn't necessarily ideal. For the Stratum, Rev'it have taken a completely different approach. Stratum means different layers, and that is exactly what we have here. And we have something that I would say, price point aside, let's just park that for a moment. This is one of the most capable and best executed jackets that I've ever used. I would say the trousers, they are not quite hitting the same note compared to the jacket. And that's being really, really, really critical, because they're still fantastic and they work really well. But what works perfectly, I say, as a jacket concept when it's applied to the trousers, just marginally less so. And we'll get into the nitty gritty of it a little bit more. So I've been using this throughout autumn and winter. I have used it in all sorts of horrible conditions. So the one thing I haven't really had a chance to do is put it through its paces in its sort of warmest configuration. I have absolutely no concerns there. You'll see why in a moment, because underneath what you can see here in this outer layer, you have a fully CE approved AA rated mesh jacket and trouser system, which in its own right is an incredibly good summer, spring riding, active riding, however you want to look at it, bit of adventure kit. So the Stratum Goretex in the jacket, first of all, it is essentially two different jackets in one combined. You cannot get them individually separately. We did ask the question. This is sold as a package, and this is a package that's designed really to cater to the needs of all serious adventure riders. And it should do at that price point, let's be honest. So what you get in the outer, first of all, because that's what we can see here, is, I think, a cracking looking. Like, it really does look amazing. A lot of adventure jackets have this sort of familiar four pockets at the front type of approach, which is a little bit old hat, because a lot of people tend to ride with backpacks, hydration packs, utility vests and so on. And I don't see the need to have tons and tons of things actually in pockets on your person, because they're just gonna be uncomfortable. You can kind of keep things more simple, and you can accessorize as you want with a removable utility vest or backpack, as I was saying. For me, that's a slightly better approach. And in essence, we therefore have a cleaner look here. We have this really, really cool storm hood, which often gets in the way around the neck when you have storm flaps and storm hoods going on. Here it doesn't at all, and it gives it a really, really nice look. So from a vanity point of view, I think this jacket looks absolutely nailed on, 100% cracking as an adventure item. I also love the colors of it. Goes really well with the Tenere 700 that we have at Adventure Rider. And I just think they've really nailed it in terms of look, which is an important point here. Let's face it, we want to look really good, especially if we're spending this sort of money. So on this outer layer, this is a Goretex 3L fabric. This has different versions of the Goretex 3L, so we have Goretex 3L Pro and so on and so forth. Without getting too bogged down in the nitty gritty there, Goretex 3L is the highest rated version of Goretex's licensed waterproof and breathable laminated membrane, which is the market leader in terms of public perception and performance. It's right up there with the very best, of course, and it comes with a lifetime guarantee in terms of that waterproofing. So should anything fail, you know you're covered there. Things very rarely do. They're always well made, because Goretex have to take them off for testing and verification. You can see you have different finishes of fabric. So we have a super fabric-like substance here on the shoulders and elbows, which is a heavier duty nylon essentially than what you get in the other sections. But ultimately this Goretex 3L is stiff, and that's really kind of intentional when it comes to this outer layer. So this is designed for the inclement weather when you want a really substantial windbreaker outer layer on as well, or even if you are going through, you know, a very sort of wooded area where perhaps you have lots of things like branches sticking out that are going to reach away and grab at your gear and clothing and sort of mess them up. This is a very durable fabric, and I wouldn't expect it to be affected at all by any of those things. Keeping it simple is also good in terms of waterproofing because you have less pockets where water can get in. You do have a few, so you have this AquaGuard zip just on the arm here. Up here we have a ventilation on either side on the arms. We have a very substantial pocket with a waterproof zip down the 3/4 section here as well, which I'm not sure is really necessary, but I think people would complain if there were no storage options on this outer. But I personally didn't enjoy using it that much because it's a waterproof zip. It's slightly stiffer, it's slightly more difficult to operate. And I would always recommend, if it's really horrible to the point that this is why you're wearing an outer layer like this, that you put your devices, the sort of sensitive things like phones and stuff, in an under section of the jacket. So as we go round, just quickly doing a little twirl with this, you can see there's a few bits of reflective material. You have this grippy and slightly more hard wearing and very sort of stylish pattern. I don't know how else to describe it. I just think it looks really, really good. You've got exit vents on the 3/4 sections on the back, and you have the Rev'it branding, very understated, with reflective element on the back and just the sort of normal molded section on either arm. So clean designs, really, really good looking. I think this will work on pretty much any kind of adventure bike where it's slightly more retro looking or in character, or anything really modern, anything from sort of enduro-y all the way through to the big bikes. I just think this works really, really well. So here we have this storm flap. We have, for when we're off the bike, a substantially waterproof hood, which you can toggle in with these elasticated pulls. You can very easily take this hood off as well. There is one zip that goes around. It's not really possible to do, I would say, by yourself. You need to do it off when you're off the bike. But with it removed, you can see kind of how clean this is and unfussy. You have this very easy to operate zip down the center, which also is a waterproof AquaGuard zip. And then here we get into the interesting stuff. So underneath here, you can ride along with this fully undone, and you will see the emergence of this mesh underlayer right there. And what is really very impressive about the Stratum is just how well the two jackets actually do work together, because ultimately they are two separate jackets. The underlayer, as I said, it's CE approved to level AA for abrasion and impact resistance. So this jacket has been through testing in that configuration, in the mesh configuration only, without the outer shell. The outer shell has separately been tested for CE approval to level B. Level B is a bit of a catch-all term because it can't be A, AA or AAA if the layer itself does not have armour included within it. Now in the Stratum, the armour is in the underlayer, and we'll get back to that in a moment because that's a very, very good thing. But that means that this has a degree of abrasion resistance. We won't know if it's on the sort of realms of A, AA or AAA, but safe to say it's a Goretex 3L fabric with, you know, very high denier nylon in most of these areas. So it's going to be high. And combined, I think it's safe to say, though we can't for legal reasons say exactly that, it would be AAA overall as a comprehensive unit, but the whole thing doesn't get submitted on that basis. You have to submit the two separately. It's very confusing, but in essence, you're getting something you can rest assured if you have a slide, it's going to hold up very, very well, and either layer in their own right are going to do a good job. So as we go further down, so as you saw there, you could have this outer jacket on with the shell layer with the 3L, but you could have it open and vented here, and you could also have it down the arms as well. So this actually gives a good amount of ventilation even with the outer on. And then as we go down inside, so if you are riding in the fully spec'd configuration as we have it currently on the mannequin, you can see that underneath you've got storage options, which is essentially on the inner jacket itself. You have a removable kidney belt, which is relatively useful for keeping things in place. I found it made it quite comfortable. It made you feel quite secure and sort of dialed into the jacket. The other thing I found is that the ergonomics of this were absolutely fantastic. So moving around on the bike with everything on, it was unnoticeable. And that's the highest compliment I think you can say when it comes to gear. When you notice your gear, when it's constrictive, that's when it starts to get annoying. And that was slightly more the case with the trousers, which again, pause that point, we'll come back to it in a moment. But then as you see underneath here, so pockets either side, very, very comfortable as well in a jacket. We then have two simple zips either side, which have a 180-degree rotating pull element, which helps you do them up in different ways, again, which we'll show you more in a minute. So this simply unzips one side, and then if I can find the matching piece on the other, and then the other. And what we reveal is the underside of the outer shell, which has a couple of pockets in its own right, but ultimately you can see that laminated fabric there. Very extensive, very comfortable, very durable. Soft piping with just a neoprene around the neck as well to make things comfy there. Ergonomics are really well considered. Before I discard this outer layer, I also want to pay homage to the cuffs, which are really easy to do with this big overlay Velcro flap with a gusted piece on it as well, which makes everything very easy to do with gloves on when you're fully waterproof spec'd up in winter. There's no fighting it when it comes to the jacket. So here we have your underlayer, your mesh, breathable, lightweight, very stretchy, summer, warm weather, active adventure riding, touring jacket. And this is as good as anything we've seen from any other brand that does this kind of thing. AA rating is going to give you a fantastic level of protection and abrasion resistance without going too far and ending up with fabrics that don't have enough stretch and give in them. This feels incredibly light. It feels like a base layer to use. I did use this in its own when we were out filming and shooting in the very cold and wet Surrey Hills for the B-roll that hopefully you can see at the moment. And yeah, really suffering for my art because it was not the weather for it. But just to illustrate the point of this being a very, very good, very comprehensive, lightweight, you cannot wish for more airflow when it comes to a mesh jacket. So this really offers everything you're going to want when it comes to a lightweight, technical, abrasion-resistant underlayer. And the point I very briefly touched upon about armour being fitted on the underlayer is really important because a lot of adventure jackets, modular jackets, the layered approach, the armour is usually in the outer layer, which is not as ideal because that armour, let's say you take out the thermal inner liner, you take out a waterproof membrane, ultimately you are releasing layers and increasing space between your arm and the armour. There's freedom of movement there, and often with adventure stuff, it lacks a little bit of finesse and it lacks a little bit of stretch for ergonomics, just so it doesn't fight you. But that means that armour might mislocate when it needs to be in the right place at the right time. The best approach by far is having it form-fitted to you, which is exactly what the Stratum achieves here. And this is what we see in some other brands that we're presenting to you on this channel, and we really would recommend this approach highly. If you think about it, it follows the approach of motocross and enduro riders where you have an armour layer fitted to you with a jersey over the top. That's great. Those guys don't really need abrasion resistance quite as much because in theory, they're not going as fast and traveling along the pavement, God forbid. Whereas in adventure riding, we're doing a mixture of everything and we need it to be able to be capable of protecting us in all situations. So form-fitting armour is by far and away the best approach. And you get it here in this underlayer. And therefore, when you layer up, you're not removing that form-fitted element. It still stays exactly as it is. So it's a really clever approach. It's not a cheap approach to execute. And we've seen that the price quickly mounts up. In essence, you're probably paying about half and half. I would say even perhaps more than half of the Goretex 3L shell on the outer. Going back to this garment itself, in terms of the features, there are just lots of mesh panels and airflow. It is as you can see it. You've got the simple central puller, you've got a couple of storage options, you've got a little system here which goes with the Krieger Hydropack integration, so you can have the bladder integrated actually into the garment itself. You've got a couple of different adjustment options on the arms, so you can taper this in. You've got these very elasticated thumb loops which help getting the jacket on and off. And one thing that I do commend it for is when you get the jacket section on and off, taking it off, putting it on, the two layers are not fighting each other. They are working quite well together. It's quite easy to get everything on and off. I didn't find it a workout with the jacket. Completely different picture with the trousers. Again, I'm going to get onto those in just a moment's time. 3/4 zippers with storage, so useful to have something there should you need it. Doesn't detract obviously from the ventilation. Overall styling, pretty good, pretty neutral. Branding is reflective where you can see it in this layer. You've got extra layers of abrasion resistant on the impact zones on the elbows and shoulders. The hydro pack can fit in here in this little reservoir area at the back, and that's what leads to these two channels here. A big loop at the back, which is always useful for hanging the jacket because it's going to need something fairly substantial. You can't just have one of those little nylon loops that you find on normal bits of clothing, because this is altogether a relatively heavy bit of gear, but as I say, not quite as heavy as things of the past, well, still currently available, but things like the Dominator jacket, which I think this surpasses in terms of technical innovation in practice when it comes to adventure riding in itself. So with the jacket, just to summarize, an extremely expensive bit of gear, but what we do have is something that's going to basically have our backs in all conditions. I think the one limitation of this jacket is the scenario where you want to be waterproof but also keep relatively cool, which is a difficult challenge for any manufacturer. And I would say there are other jackets out there where there is a lighter waterproof element going on, which means you're not adding as much insulation, windbreaking, and so on to the overall feel of the jacket. So if it's a summer's day and it's raining, with this on, I think you're gonna get very warm quite quickly. So it would be more ideal if you did have a really thin packaway waterproof, and you might see that as something of a compromise. But what this does cater to is if you have the budget and you wanted to have a bit of gear that you could take round the world, genuinely do absolutely anything, and know that yes, in certain situations, there's always going to be a small element of compromise, but in all situations, you're gonna have a good sort of 8 to 9 out of 10 rating for what you'd want, then this absolutely covers that. And it's virtually impossible to get 10 out of 10 in all spheres. It's just not. You either need multiple jackets for different conditions, or you need to sacrifice somewhere. So this does as good a job, I think, as I've seen of trying to tackle all those different considerations for an adventure rider. Does it in a modern and dynamic way. So the trousers follow exactly the same principles as the jacket, with a AAC approved mesh layer underneath with the level 2C approved armour included, and you have this outer layer of level B with the Goretex 3L Pro membrane. It's just that the ergonomics play out slightly differently. As you can see on the mannequin, it's sitting a little bit low, and that's because there's not really too much room for error around things like the crotch and the seat of the pants. And that means that there's a little bit of restriction in the movement. I found myself having to do the adventure method of getting on the bike by standing on the pegs and lifting my leg over first, because I didn't have the freedom of movement in the trousers that I have in my normal riding trousers. And if you have things like panniers or soft luggage and top boxes and so on that you need to really be able to swing your leg out over even more, then you're going to find it a bit of a challenge with these on. I don't necessarily think this is a fault of the garment. I just think it comes more down to what we're familiar with as riders and people. And when it's a jacket, I think we're more familiar with the idea of layering, things that are removable. It doesn't feel weird having essentially two jackets on top. It does feel slightly weird having two trousers, one on top of the other, because what you have under here, as we'll see, is another zipper under the outer layer, another overlay button and flap. And that means you're really putting on two things. And then when you're sat down on the bike with it in its fully spec'd configuration with everything in, you basically have quite a lot going on there. And then you've got the jacket sitting over the top of it, and it's all sort of bunched up, you know, around your stomach, and it feels very substantial. It feels a little bit constrictive. In the legs, when you are sort of trying to swing your leg over the seat and stuff like that, that's where you really sort of notice it the most. And if you have a taller bike, for example, I have the T7, which is a relatively tall bike. I'm a relatively tall rider, but I still found myself struggling to get toes down on some of the really rutted, muddy, deep sections where, you know, the ground is uneven and you don't want to miss your footing. Slightly more problematic when the trousers don't give you a lot of room for error. There's no stretch in this outer fabric. There is in the underlayer. So in the underlayer, in its mesh configuration, if that's how you're going to set it up on a ride, or, you know, when it turns warmer weather on a ride or whatever, that works perfectly. That's really nice, lightweight and unrestricted. But having all this going on the trouser is quite a lot. Now, there's lots of things that go a long way to mitigating that, and it's not to say these trousers are not worth buying, and they're not frankly worth the money, because, as I said, any other brand doing things that is a Goretex 3L outer with anything like this underneath, they're few and far between, but they're always around this kind of price point. There are things that make it a lot easier to live with than it would otherwise be. Namely, we have the way that the legs come all the way up the side with this massive zipper. So this means getting these trousers on and off is very easy. And as you see underneath with this mesh layer, this is designed to go under the boot, so it fits really neatly in, and this is designed to go over the boot. And because you have this massive zip, it's really easy to do that. You don't struggle. It's not a matter of fine margins between being able to actually do them up and not do them up. It's very, very easy to do. You also have the zips the waterproof zips for storage on the side there. And as we go around, you see things are just fairly straightforward. You've got the 2 pockets on the back, a slightly higher rise around the waist. You've got the grip panels on the inside of the leg towards the seat of the pant, which is good for giving you grip. You also have this super fabric around the front, which is really where you're going to need it in terms of abrasion resistance. If you are, constantly moving around, that's where the high wear areas are going to be. So it's a really well thought through trouser. You have these vents on the inside of the leg, which if you can have a vent, that's where you're going to need it. So you can go some way with the trousers to increasing the ventilation through those zippers. It's perhaps not quite as substantial as what you can do with the jacket by effectively having that outer zip open, just keeping the under jacket zip done up, which gives you a large mesh panel down the center point, which really does a lot for airflow. This does something, but everything else is really quite substantial and thick with the Goretex 3L fabric. So as we go back to the top, this buckle system is simple to use, pretty intuitive. This is where it gets a little bit involved. So we have this central zipper, we have a gusted Goretex 3L bit of fabric underneath, and they have done well because that is a much thinner piece of fabric than the rest of it. Quite often with these gussets, you just see a continuation of the normal fabric, which causes a lot of bunching. So it is minimized there. But as we see, because that's always fixed, that doesn't stretch either. Getting them on isn't the easiest thing in the world. So I have the large here, and I would say they probably size just a tad snug because the large trousers, as someone with a sort of 32, 33 inch waist, they're still quite snug on me. And I don't think anyone that's a 34 would get away with it, which suggests sizing is a little bit on the stingy side from Rev'it on these. But then you've got this other layer underneath and another zip. And that one doesn't have a gusset on the mesh layer, it just has a very small bit of fabric. And all that means that it's quite difficult to get them on. There's no real pull point. So with everything on, it's a bit of a workout. What I said much earlier in the video, the jacket, not so much. It just zips up, everything feels like it just slots into place. The trousers, your heart rate's gonna go up a bit and you're gonna feel by the time you get on the bike like you've already done some active riding, which maybe is good as a warm up, but it's probably not ideal, especially if you're planning on using these kind of every day. They're the little things that for me make a garment go from being, your dream bit of kit to something that you're like, oh God, I've got to put these on again. But once they're on, they're brilliant. As I say, really with one exception being if you want to use them on really spirited riding in warm weather when it's also wet, you'd be better with just a lighter waterproof over a mesh thing because this is a fairly substantial Goretex 3L layer. So let's whack off this outer layer and you can see the mesh layer underneath. Ta-da! So here we have the mesh underlayer, which is a really nice bit of kit in its own right. You've got these leather panels on the inside of the leg, again, grip and extra abrasion resistance. It's already a very hard wearing fabric, but as you can see, tons of mesh, tons of breathability, really lightweight, and a good degree of stretch to this layer in particular. So freedom of movement, this is gonna be great for absolutely everything in terms of that warmer weather riding, that more spirited riding, or just touring on a hot day, just like the jacket. So it looks great, it fits great. There's also a connection zipper at the top, as you can see here, plus this very handy little loop. And you've also got the mesh breathable panels around the back, reflective strips down the side, and storage pockets over on either side with the red toggles as well. You've got these elasticated Velcro panels on the side so you can draw it in at the waist, which is useful because Mr. Mannequin here is a little bit skinny around his waist. And a simple zipper down the front. So really a very, very comfortable and ergonomic bit of kit. And in a way, it's sort of a shame that Rev'it don't offer it on its own. They offer it as part of this fully fledged adventure solution in the Stratum jacket and trousers. So in conclusion, the Rev'it Stratum Goretex jacket and trousers, well, it approaches adventure riding in an incredibly progressive and very technical way. Rev'it really know what they're doing, and the thinking behind this of having a fully encompassed CE-approved AA rated underlayer that basically is your spring-summer outfit in its own right, or your active wear in its own right, is a very clever approach, and then layering up with the waterproofing over on top. It makes perfect sense and it works perfectly when it comes to the jacket. The trousers I'm being really harsh about, and I'm only being harsh because of the price point, because at $950, I'd want my trousers to be as perfect as my 1,250 quid jacket. And just with everything that's going on around this area, and the fact that by its nature, the Goretex 3L doesn't really have a stretch to it, it brings in certain limitations to the trousers that I don't think the jacket suffers from. Ideally, if you could buy these trousers in this format individually and then layer up with a much lighter waterproof outer, which of course you can do if you buy the system, you wouldn't have to take the outer 3L layer with you. You could have your lightweight waterproofs stowed away somewhere, that's still perfectly viable, but that's another thing to buy. But that then would give me the perfect blend of everything I'd want from a proper adventure outfit that I think Rev'it have done a really, really good job in designing, and with a couple of tweaks perhaps to the 3L layer on the trousers, I think we would have an absolutely perfect set of kit. It's almost impossible to get everything perfectly. At this price point though, they've got pretty close, and I think they need to be commended for coming out with something that definitely rivals the quality of the high price point garments on offer from some of the other brands in the adventure sector. So I'd love to know what you guys think. There's a lot to digest there, philosophically, technically. So please do leave us your comments and feedback. But ultimately, Rev'it's flagship item for 24, I think they can be very, very proud of it. I've certainly enjoyed using it. And there are plenty more things coming from Rev'it, and some of them at vastly lower price points that in some senses perhaps do an even better job. So do stay tuned. We've got lots of wonderful content coming on this channel, things from Rev'it, things from other brands, things you'll be familiar with in the past and things that you won't, and much outside of the studio as well. So with all that said, hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.